All right. Hello, everybody. How's it going? This is Mr. H, and today we are going over the Cold War. Now, this has been taking a little while in class, so my apologies for that, but I'll try to make it a little bit quicker for this recording for everybody studying virtually or people trying to review. So I'll be going over this presentation that's actually in Summit, so that should make things a little bit easier. So let's see. There we go. All right. Can you see that all right? Let me make it a slideshow. There we go. So that should be working for you. So the objectives for today is we're going to go over the differences in ideology between the US and USSR after World War I. Now, ideology means the ideals or values of a country. And so in this case, we have very different ideologies between these two players in the Cold War. We're also going to be examining events and policies which increase tension. So the stuff that happened between these two countries. We're going to identify how the arms race and the threat of nuclear weapons influenced superpowers during Cold War. We're not talking about wearing tank tops. We're not talking about going to the gym. An arms race. This is actually when two countries are both competing to have the most weapons. In particular, we're talking about nuclear weapons, but there's lots of different arms that we're talking about here. And it even got into the space race as well. And then we're also going to be looking at alliances, and that's ways that countries actually band together. Remember those alliances that were at the root of World War I? We're going to be getting into stuff like that. So now we have ideologies and tensions between the US and USSR. So a little bit of background, we all should remember Germany surrendered in May of 1945, and we had the Yalta Conference right before that surrender and the Potsdam right after, agreed to denazify and divide Germany between the Allies. And while there were 4 allies who got pieces of both Germany and Berlin, the US, UK, France, and the USSR, the US and France and Britain really became the West German and West Berlin bloc, and the Soviets became the Soviet or East Germany, East Berlin bloc. And if you remember, Berlin is 100 miles into East Germany, so it made it kind of awkward, and we'll see some of the impacts of that. We also had the Nuremberg trials, where the heads of various Nazi agencies were put on trial for war crimes and for their role in the Holocaust. It was also a way to publish and document all of the horrible things that happened during the Holocaust. Now, there's also, you have to remember that Europe is devastated after World War II. Almost all countries, except maybe Spain and Switzerland, got heavily bombed, had massive loss of life. And so they're practically post-apocalyptic wastelands. And so the US and USSR are now superpowers, but they are both very different superpowers. The USSR just lost 25 million people. They went from having their army almost destroyed to now they have the largest army in the world. And that army has conquered all of Eastern Europe. Now, Eastern Europe and Western USSR are both destroyed, just absolutely bombed till they're rubble. And so they have a lot of rebuilding to do. But they also, as a communist state, they have massive resources, and they do have lots of factories, especially the ones that they just took in Germany, as well as the factories that they were using to build up their army. The US, on the other hand, aside from Pearl Harbor and some of the Aleutian Islands, had almost no attacks upon it during World War II, and they ramped up their production incredibly from an also-ran economy before World War II to the #1 economy in the world, the #1 Navy in the world, the most expensive and most advanced military in the world. And US is coming in hot with a hot economy. And don't forget the Lend-Lease Act that helped them supply all those weapons, ammunition, food, and supplies to their allies. Those were loans. Lend, lease both mean we give you stuff, but we're expecting something later. And so the United States is quite wealthy, while all these countries are completely bankrupt. And so the United States is going to be using its new superpower status to expand its sphere of influence. So the beginning is the Cold War. The Soviets want to rebuild their economy, and they want to do it using German industry. This has been a goal of the communists since before the Soviet Union was even a thing. Marx and Engels were both German. Lenin lived in Germany and Switzerland, and they always talked about how great it would be to have Germany as a communist nation and take all those means of production and give them to the workers. And so now they have a big chunk of Germany, and they're going to use that to rebuild their economy. The Allies agreed to divide Germany temporarily. Soviets want a buffer zone. So they're trying to make sure that they don't get invaded again. They just got invaded in 2 world wars in a row, both of them catastrophic for the Soviet people. One completely ended the Russian Empire, and the other killed 25 million people. And they're traumatized. And before that, you had Napoleon invading Russia. So they're looking at the West and saying, we can't trust you guys anymore. We need a buffer zone. We need a little bit of space, okay? And they got the space because they just conquered Eastern Europe. Now, Americans, they're a little bit different. We're not so traumatized. We only lost 400,000 people in World War II. And so we're saying, hey, you know, we're a democracy. We're a capitalist country. We want to see other democracies succeed. We want people to have self-determination. And this isn't just at the expense of the Soviet Union. This is also at the expense of people like Britain, who have massive colonial empires, many of which they lost during World War II to Japanese and Germans. And so they're listening to this, I talk about self-determination and being like, whoa, wait a minute there, America. Is your self-determination for everybody? And the Americans are saying, yeah, we want people to have elections. But we don't really have that much of a say in places that we don't have a military presence, like Eastern Europe. So what was the Cold War? It's a Cold War because it's not a hot war. So this means that the US and USSR are not fighting directly. We never declared war on each other. We never fought our troops against theirs. And there's a good reason for that. And we'll get into that in a little bit. But so instead of a hot war, what we have is an economic, diplomatic, and ideological war. Discord, not that thing you use to chat with your buddies on the internet during video games, but Discord means kind of chaos and conflict, a chaotic conflict happening on economic levels, on diplomatic levels, and ideological levels. And so why was this? Well, the US and USSR, they got some similarities, although you might see a lot of these are kind of like similar differences. But they definitely shared that they agreed Hitler was the worst. So you got that going for him. However, Stalin and Mao Zedong from China are both going to give Hitler a run for his money on most civilians killed by a dictator. And I believe they both beat Hitler by killing tens of millions of their own people. So the US is going to definitely not like to hear that. They both wanted their values and economic and political systems to prevail. So when thinking about these things like sphere of influence, we're talking about places that are being impacted by the values of another place. And so in this case, the US has our capitalist economy, and we have democratic political systems. And the Russians have their communist economy and their Soviet or Bolshevik political systems that they want to see spread. And they want spheres of influence, which means areas that aren't necessarily under their direct control, but are within their area of shared values. And both agreed that capitalism and communism could not coexist. These are fundamentally incompatible. They just don't fit with each other. Capitalism believes in the free market. It believes people make their own choices, but it also believes in their ability to become rich while other people are poor. They believe in democracy, where democracy allows you to choose your leaders and have multiple parties vying for control with free speech. Communism is pretty much the opposite. They believe that the government should control things, that the workers should control the means of production, and there shouldn't be so much choice. You should just from each according to his abilities, to each according to his needs. And so communism doesn't necessarily believe in all this free choice stuff. They don't believe that you should select your leaders. Instead, they believe that the leaders should be Bolsheviks and that Soviets should report to them, and everybody should have that Soviet system, which are like local councils. And so these are really incompatible. They also believe that the other is a threat to their existence. So the US looks at the USSR and they say, we've read Marx, we've read Engels, we know what the Communist Manifesto is, we know what Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin are all about, and it is communism everywhere. They believe that communism is the natural end state of government, that it's this evolutionary process from monarchs to constitutional monarchies, to democratic republics, and then communism as the final state where the proletariat, the working people, overthrow their bourgeois or middle class and their upper class rulers and seize control of the means of production. And communists believed this was inevitable everywhere, and it was their right and their job to spread that wherever they could. And so that kind of scared all these democracies that don't really want to see that happen. And on the other side, the Soviets saw capitalism as a exploitative, imperialist, colonial way of taking advantage of these same workers that they saw as being the natural, rightful rulers of the world. And so they wanted to do whatever they could to stop the spread of capitalism and see capitalism towards its end state of communism. Now, a lot of people disagree with whether or not that is actually the way things progress, but this is what they believed at the time. So capitalism is based on freedom and competition, okay? And this can have positives and negatives. You have the freedom to choose your leaders. You have the freedom to choose what you buy. You have the freedom to start a business, to own land. You have the freedom to do what you want to do with your time. Competition means in a perfect world, you have all these small businesses and you have many different options for things. And that competition results in lower prices. It results in more and more innovative things that are available to people. Anytime there's a market need, somebody can come and meet that need, and then they'll compete with other people, and it'll make more opportunity and more resources available for everybody through this idea of competition. On the flip side, it also means that you're wide open through that freedom for influence from things like fascism or from communism. That competition can be cutthroat, and you can end up having some competitors achieving oligopolies or monopolies where they get tons of resources and they box everybody else out. And that competition can take the form of imperialism, where you're competing to exploit resources from other countries. Likewise, communism is based on equality and fair contributions. So equality meaning everybody does everything they can for their job, no matter what that job is. If you're a doctor, if you're a lawyer, if you're a street sweeper or a cashier at a store, or you're working on a farm, everybody just does their job, and they get fair contributions in exchange for that, and they get their needs met, and that's it. Now, this sounds like a really good thing on paper. Everybody's equal. There's no unemployment. There's no homelessness. Everybody gets their base needs met. But it also means there's not a lot of incentive to go above and beyond. There's not an incentive to find inefficiencies to exploit, or opportunities to create new jobs or new businesses or new inventions. And it also means maybe you just do the bare minimum and just kind of skate by on your government stipend. So what you end up with is a lot of waste and a lot of inefficiency, and no real incentive for people to innovate or to try their hardest. And so in order to make sure that everybody's contributing, because if everybody's being lazy and inefficient, the government needs to step in. And that's where you start getting no freedom and no choice. And you end up with totalitarian states controlling every aspect of people's lives through violence. And so these are sort of the core tenets of capitalism and communism, and some of their pros and cons. Both of them look pretty good on paper, but in practice, they have some issues. Some of the differences: Soviets see that capitalism just caused the entire world to go to war twice, okay? And they're saying these were imperialist wars, fighting over resources by these super rich capitalists. Nazism, fascism, all these things are kind of like examples of capitalism taken to its logical, disgusting, racist end game. And so to them, they see capitalism as the cause of all these problems, and they just need to replace it so that there could be peace and there would be no more imperialism and exploitation and colonialism and all those things. And honestly, some of these were fair critiques of capitalism, and capitalism was in the midst of grappling with a lot of these critiques at this time. Likewise, Americans look at communism, they say, yeah, you guys talk like you're a bunch of nice peace, freedom, equality loving hippies, but in reality, you're a totalitarian state that is controlling every aspect of your people's lives. You have no freedom of speech. You have no competition between political parties. You have no competition of businesses. And so you end up with massive fraud and corruption, and you're subjugating your people and other nations. And honestly, this is true too. They were basically just doing imperialism with more steps, by taking over all these Eastern European countries and exploiting them. So both of them not really wrong in their critiques of each other, but a little bit short-sighted in their assessment of themselves. And so after World War II, Soviet Union holds on to all these Eastern Bloc countries and says, we're just going to stay here. And Winston Churchill looks at all these new communist countries and sees them being occupied by the Red Army and says an Iron Curtain has descended upon Eastern Europe. Now, you might wonder, why do they say Iron Curtain? Why not Iron Wall? Well, if you look at the lines, it's not exactly straight. It's a little wavy like a curtain. And it's not a solid wall yet. The Berlin Wall is coming. But it's more of a metaphorical wall. You can see through it. You can walk across it. But the ideological divide that's happening here and the lack of freedom that the people on the other side of the Iron Curtain have really is strong and palpable and hard to overcome. And the fact that the Red Army is there enforcing it, and you have Stalin's totalitarian Soviet dictatorship ruling these people's lives, the people living in the democratic West feel like they're now cut off from the people in the Soviet East. Here's a graphic depiction of the Iron Curtain, showing the UN trying to lift it, and the US and France looking on and saying, oh man, what are you going to do about it? So we have competition for political influence, okay? And politics can mean both domestic and foreign. And this was a primary cause of the Cold War. And you have things like competition through military, okay? So who can have the best tanks? Who can have the best airplanes? The most aircraft carriers? The most nukes? The arms race. You have espionage. So here you have the United States and Britain especially had some of the highest caliber espionage in history during World War II, but they shared a lot of that with the Soviets. And they're going to find that the Soviets are a formidable opponent when it comes to espionage and spycraft, partly because totalitarian governments have an advantage, especially on the defense against spycraft, against espionage, because they control every aspect of their citizens' lives. So they can see pretty quickly when somebody shows up that's from a different culture and not really belonging there. Plus, they can control the media that they're seeing, the news that they're getting. And so they're able to clamp down, and they have a significant advantage on the defense during this espionage war. And they're able to actually get a lot of technology through that, such as atomic technology, rocket technology, that kind of thing. You also see sports, especially the Olympics, where every 4 years you have these two countries and really their respective spheres of influence showing up and trying to show their stuff and say, hey, look at how good our athletes are. Look at how strong our people are, how fast they are. Clearly, this shows the superiority of our system. And they use different strategies for it. There's a lot of performance-enhancing drugs. There's some fascinating stuff in there. I might put some links in to Schoology about it. But yeah, sports becomes one of the areas that there's tensions and competition. You also see industry, seeing who can produce the most, who can make the most stuff, and whose economies can get the strongest. And the capitalists are going to have a massive advantage here, but the Soviets have total control over their industry. So at first, it's going to look like it's going to be a pretty tough competition, but eventually capitalism will absolutely blow the communists out of the water on industry. Likewise with technology. Technology starts out fairly close, and the Soviets have some really fantastic scientists, and they also, just like the U.S., bring a bunch of Nazi scientists right after World War II into their country and take advantage of a lot of their understanding. And so over the short run, it seems like it's a pretty neck and neck, and the Soviets actually enjoy some major advantages in technology, such as the first satellite, which you can see right here, that ball with the things coming out of it, that's Sputnik. You can watch a compilation of space race fails. The U.S. actually spent about 20 years in the dust of the Soviets, watching them get achievement after achievement. First flight to space, first satellite, first man in space. Over and over, the Soviets beat us to outer space until the Apollo missions. And so it didn't seem like that there was going to be much of a difference in technology at first, and the Soviets actually seemed to have an advantage. But over time, capitalism with its free economies, with its freedom of speech, and with its massive industrial capacity and universities, did have the advantage, and they ended up getting much more technologically advanced over the decades. So the Soviet Union's goals are pretty simple. They just want to balance US influence in Western Europe. They want to protect their borders, rebuild their economy. They, especially with like industrial equipment and getting access to new materials, raw materials. And they also want to create satellite communist governments. Now, the satellite we're talking about isn't this kind of satellite like Sputnik, although both mean to orbit around a larger object. And so in this case, a satellite government would be all of those Eastern European countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania. Those aren't necessarily part of the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic, but they are in its sphere of influence. They are satellite countries that are orbiting Russia, and they have direct influence and control over them. So these are the goals of the Soviet Union. But the US wants to contain the Soviet Union because they don't like this idea of a worldwide communist revolution. They don't want to see all their allies in Western Europe, or heaven forbid, the US itself fall to communism. And so they try to limit its spread. And the way they're going to do that is with money. So the US economy is screaming right now, and everybody owes us money. We're flush with cash. We've got all the world's gold reserves, and we're looking at this post-apocalyptic wasteland that is Western Europe. And we're also seeing little communist revolutions starting to happen in places like Turkey and Greece. And we look at the nationalists, the democracies in those places, and say, hey, how about we send you some money, weapons, and soldiers if you agree that you're going to stop the communists from taking over in your country? And so we send those resources to Greece and Turkey, and it works. It works really well. They actually are successful at battling off the communists and successfully creating capitalist democracies in those places. Although sometimes we'll see dictatorships pop up, and it's going to be one of those negative side effects of this policy of containment, but we'll get into more of that later. So the Truman Doctrine says, hey, we got a blank check for any country that's worried about communists taking over. We'll give you money, we'll give you weapons and soldiers, and there's going to be a lot of all three of those things. And it's fairly successful. But what this leads to, and you can kind of see this coming, if we're giving money, soldiers, and weapons to other countries to fight against communism, well, they're going to fight against communism. So that's what a proxy war is. It's not one of those good luck, I'm behind 7 proxies kind of meme. We're talking about somebody doing something for somebody else. In this case, other countries fighting for the United States, using stuff that we supply them against people being supplied by the Soviet Union or by China. Although mostly Soviet Union at this point. And so this is a way of avoiding direct war with the Soviets by supporting other countries with supplies and resources. It comes in the form of foreign aid. And there's a tremendous amount of proxy wars that happen over the last few decades. Some are even still happening now. You could make a really compelling argument that the war in Ukraine right now is a proxy war between Russia and NATO. And it's not working out so hot for Russia right now, but you'll see that during the Cold War, it could go either way. So there's a whole bunch of proxy wars. We'll get into a bunch of them, but the Korean War, classic example of a proxy war. Vietnam War, war in Afghanistan. You're going to see a lot of these. The two we just talked about, Greece and Turkey. So there's lots and lots of proxy wars. And so while the Cold War is not a hot war between the two major combatants or opponents, it is a hot war between these proxy states. Then we have the Berlin airlift. If you watch that oversimplified video, they cover it pretty well. But basically, at a certain point, Stalin is looking at how there's this disparity between West Berlin and East Berlin, and he would like Berlin to be fully communist, especially because it's in the middle of communist East Germany. And so he cuts them off from supplies and waits for them to starve. But he cannot control the air without starting a war with the United States. So the United States uses its military planes to airlift in millions of tons of supplies over the course of a year and a half or so. And we're talking planes landing like every few minutes, unloading, flying back off all day long, 24 hours a day for months and months and months. And it's an incredible logistical undertaking. Stalin never imagined it could have happened. Just like this is a classic example of don't underestimate American stubbornness and willingness to throw money and resources at a problem. The Japanese and Nazis underestimated it during World War II, much to their disadvantage. And the Soviet Union did it here with the Berlin airlift. The United States is a stubborn, very wealthy, very productive country, and we are willing to sink tremendous amounts of resources into a problem if we think that it's important. And in this case, we did, and it was successful. It ended up ending the Soviet blockade after a little over a year. We also have the space race. Okay, so the space race is the US and USSR competing for technological dominance. And the USSR won the space race for a while. Okay, they got Sputnik up, the first satellite in outer space. But the United States got the last laugh in the space race with the Apollo 11 moon landing, where for the very first time, we were able to do something before the Russians did. And in many ways, this is a proxy war between the US and Soviet Union because there's no direct fighting between the two. And there's videos that you can watch about the space race. It's fascinating. We lost a lot, like billions of dollars worth of rockets. We lost countless astronauts to mistakes and errors and problems trying to defeat the Russians and get to outer space first. And they beat us time and time again until we finally got on the moon first. And that was really our first W in the space race. Now you have the Berlin Wall, which is further escalation. Stalin's out of the picture by this point. Now you have Nikita Khrushchev. And so we're talking 1961, you've got 2.5 million East Germans that are basically cut off from West Germany, and the Berlin Wall is built by East Germany to keep their civilians from escaping to the West because the West had such a higher standard of living. So it became a literal version of the Iron Curtain, and was initially just wire, but eventually became iron concrete walls up to 15 feet high, and was a enduring, lasting image of really the shortcomings and failings. They thought it was saying strength, but as Kennedy said, say what you will about democracy, it's not perfect, but we've never had to build a wall to keep our citizens in. So we'll also be talking about the nuclear arms race and nuclear weapons. And you can see that the United States had a big initial advantage, but over time, the Soviets built up quite the nuclear stockpile. And they kept building that up for a while. And for a while, they had quite a bit more. However, at a certain point, we started passing nuclear non-proliferation treaties back in the 80s, and you start seeing a reduction in nuclear weapons. But this was a very scary time. There were so many nukes, we could have completely destroyed the entire world many times over. And what this meant was we had a thing called mutually assured destruction. So if the US and the USSR had a full exchange, blowing up all of each other's cities with nuclear weapons, it would probably kill all life on Earth. It would have been a really bad thing. And so what this meant was we could never see them fight head to head because the risk was too high. And we did try to regulate nuclear arms, but because we held such an advantage, Soviets didn't want to participate in that. They didn't think it was very fair for us to have a head start and then gatekeep after we had all the nukes. So eventually you see things like the hydrogen bomb, which is a nuclear weapon that is thousands of times more powerful than normal nuclear devices. And this is really scary. This is where we get into full mutually assured destruction territory. The US was the first to make a hydrogen bomb, but the Soviet Union followed not too long afterwards. And so during the Cold War era, why do you think the US and Soviet Union didn't want to have direct military conflict? Well, because there's a famous saying, I don't know what weapons World War III will be fought with, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones. And that's because the nuclear weapons were so powerful, we would have almost no capacity we would have destroyed all technology and destroyed all civilization if we do actually fight World War III. So we may anticipate a state of affairs in which the two great powers will each be in a position to put an end to the civilization and life of the other, though not without risking its own. We may be likened to two scorpions in a bottle, each capable of killing the other, but only at the risk of his own life. So the whole Cold War was like two scorpions in a bottle, both killing each other. And so the only way to win was to not fight. That's a War of the Worlds quote. So now you have alliances like the North American Treaty Organization, or NATO, which is still around to this day, even after the fall of the USSR. And this was a way to resist Soviet aggression. They were threatened by the idea of communist expansion and the rising threat of the Soviet Union. And so they tried to create a unified military defense. So countries that were a part of it were the United States, Canada, and most other European capitalist countries. The Soviet Union responded with the Warsaw Pact, which brought in pretty much the whole Eastern Bloc and a whole bunch of other countries that agreed to defend one another if attacked by outside forces. So they had 7 Soviet satellite states as part of the Warsaw Pact. And that is it for today. I know we covered a lot of stuff. I feel like I'm talking really fast, but I just wanted to get this out to you, and good luck on the PFA tomorrow. So have a great one. Bye.